Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. I had an inspiration to create some coastal decor and I realized it's going to be really inexpensive to make. Under $4 in materials plus paint and glue. And the great thing about this project is I think it's going to have a big impact and it's really customizable. You'll be able to make it look exactly how you want. Let's go have some fun.
Okay, so the first thing we need to do is cut up our pool noodle. And my ruler measured in centimeters. I cut lengths of pool noodle that were 8 centimeters, 10 centimeters, and 12 centimeters. That translates to about 3.5 to 5 inches if your ruler measures in inches. So I cut the 3 different lengths. Of course, you can cut any lengths that you like, or you could keep them all the same. I wanted mine to look like an eclectic collection of buoys. I just used a Sharpie and my ruler, and I marked the pool noodle where I wanted to cut it, and then I used a kitchen knife to cut it. I found a longer knife works better for cutting the pool noodle. Once I had my pieces cut, I needed to shape them to look like buoys. So what I did was I measured down the buoy and marked, again with a Sharpie. And the amount that I measured down varied from about 1/3 of the way down to about half the way down. And I varied that on my different buoys of different lengths so that, again, I had an eclectic collection so that they didn't all look the same. I wanted inconsistency here. Once I've measured down and marked around, I then marked around the hole at the top. And at first I thought I would try to measure that, but it really was easiest just to pick a distance around that hole that isn't very far, like 1 centimeter or less, and then draw a mark with the Sharpie. So now I have 2 marks. I have one that is around the circumference, the body of the buoy, which is like 1/3 to 1/2 of the way down. And I have one around that hole in the top. And I'm going to cut between those 2 marks. So that's going to give me that tapered look. And again, I found it easiest to cut with the knife, at least at first. So I did 4 cuts from mark to mark, or as best as I could, with the knife, you know, at like 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. And then I used some scissors to trim between those marks and do the best I could to shape it and make it look good. Now, I think you can work with the pool noodle as it is. I tried to spray paint just a piece of pool noodle, and it did take the spray paint. I used a primer spray paint. I have heard that foam can be tricky with spray paint, but I didn't have a problem with that. So you probably could leave it, but I wasn't very good at shaping it really nicely at the top. So I thought if I paper mache over it, I'll be able to smooth that out a little bit. I'm not really sure how successful I was. I tried 3 different methods of paper mache. So I wanted to show you 3 different ways to do this, tell you what I think the advantages and disadvantages of each of these ways are, and then you can choose what's best for you and who's creating this project with you. For example, you might make a different choice if you're doing this with children versus on your own. So the first method that I used, which I would say is the preferred method for an outcome if you want these to be outside or just for how well the paper mache works on them, is to use this stuff called Flex Bond. I have this bag of Flex Bond that I keep in my basement, and I think it's some sort of, I don't know if it's a tile grout or something. I bought this at Home Depot. and it has some really nasty warnings on the package. So you really should work with this outdoors. In the past when I've worked with it outdoors. This time I did work with it indoors, but I wore a respirator while I worked with it. You're also supposed to wear gloves when you're working with it. The Flex Bond is going to give you a really good finish, especially if you want to use your buoys outside. So the way to use it is sort of like normal paper mache. You're going to cut up strips of some kind of paper. I used newspaper. And then you're going to mix the Flex Bond, it's a powder, mix it with water until you get a consistency that is like a wet paste. And you're going to take your strips, put them in the Flex Bond, and then sort of squeeze off or slide off any extra Flex Bond, and then wrap them around your buoys. It's a little bit difficult to work with. It's very thick and it's sort of heavy, but it does give you a very nice finish. Now, the second way that I did the paper mache is more traditional, and that's just using regular old white glue, school glue, PVA glue. I got mine at the Dollar Tree, and mix that with a little bit of water, and then the same thing with the newspaper. Get it completely saturated with your glue and water mixture, and then you're going to wipe off the newspaper so it isn't too wet, and then wrap it around your buoys. Now, I found the newspaper with the white glue a little bit more difficult to work with than the Flex Bond, and smaller pieces of newspaper worked better for me with the glue mixture, particularly around the top where the buoy had been shaped. Now, the third thing that I tried was Sculptamold. And I've used Sculptamold before. I'll include a link here to when I did castings and I used Sculptamold. Look at the package because you might mix it a little bit differently for a casting versus using it to put over an armature, which is basically what we're doing here. So make sure you're doing the right ratio of Sculptamold to water if you are using the Sculptamold product. If you do watch that video, or if you've watched that video, you know that we made our own Sculptamold out of paper pulp and plaster of Paris. So you could also try that, making your own Sculptamold. Now the Sculptamold, it was difficult to get it to stick to the styrofoam. That was a little frustrating, but it will stick to itself. So if you can get it around the styrofoam and then keep building it onto itself, you should be able to get the entire buoy covered. And then what I did was I wet my hand and ran it over the Sculptamold, and that allowed me to smooth it out. And now the big advantage, I'd say, to the Sculptamold is if you didn't cut your buoy very carefully at the top, and I had a few where I'd cut one side a little bit more than the other areas, then you can sort of fill that in with just a little bit extra Sculptamold. So that would be the advantage to the Sculptamold. Now with the three of them, the Flex Bond dried the most quickly, and the Sculptamold took the longest to dry. I put them out in the sun to get them to dry because I had left them overnight and they still needed a little more drying. So once they're all finished, here's what they look like. That first one was my prototype just to see if I could spray paint the foam all by itself. And then these are the Flex Bond. These next ones are obviously the traditional paper mache with the newspaper, and I did do most of them that way. And then the final ones are the Sculptamold. And you can see they're a little bit thicker, they're a tiny bit heavier, but I was able to have more control over the shape. So what I did was I coated them with some primer spray paint, and I did the tops, the bottoms, and of course the sides. And now it's time to have some fun painting, so let's go over some of the paints that I have. So for blue paints, I have this, the bright blue is Americana by Deco Art True Blue. And then I have a chalk paint, which is Cascade nautical, and that ended up being my favorite color in the light blue. The other one is a light blue that I absolutely love that I use all the time, and that's the Craft Smart Muted Aqua. Now for greens, I have Crafter's Edition Christmas Green, which I mixed with some white when I used it. And then I also have Folk Art Home Decor Chalk Paint, and the color is Grotto. So those were the greens and the blues. Now I also have a bright red, which is Craft Smart Tuscan Red, and I used that straight, but then I also mixed it with some Rich Art Brown, which is the Dollar Tree acrylic paint, and I liked it much better when it was mixed with the brown. I also used some gray, and the gray is the Folk Art Home Decor Chalk Paint, and the color is Castle. Now these chalk paints, I bought them in a set, and I'll include a link in the description in case you're interested in the set of chalk paints. It came with others in addition to the ones that I used here, but there's some really nice colors. So I also mixed just some of the apple barrel white and black that I have in order to get some gray. And I wanted to use, again, the Folk Art Home Decor Chalk Paint. I wanted to use the color Sheepskin, but my sheepskin had dried up. So I mixed my apple barrel white with the Rich Art yellow, which I got from the Dollar Tree, because it turned out I didn't have any yellow paint, so I just grabbed that acrylic yellow at the Dollar Tree. So I mixed a tiny bit of that into the apple barrel acrylic white, and I was able to get a color that I thought was pretty close to the sheepskin chalk paint. Now I have this Dollar Tree painter's tape, and I wondered if I would be able to use it on these. I was hoping it wouldn't pull up any of the paper mache, and it didn't. You'll also notice it kind of looks like a buoy with a stripe on it with the painter's tape, so I think it's possible you could even use tape to make stripes. I didn't. I used the tape to paint stripes. So I used the painter's tape, and in some places, like particularly where these are sculpted, I had to press it down. Also, in some places, I didn't really rely on the painter's tape, I just used it as a guide in painting. And sometimes I used the whole piece, and sometimes I cut it down the middle and used a half width. Of course, painter's tape comes in different widths. This is just one I picked up, as I said, at the Dollar Tree. And I put it in different places. So on some of these, I just painted 2 different colors. On some, I painted like one stripe of one color and then 2 colors on either end, or a stripe around the middle and a stripe around the top, and then 2 colors or 3 different colors. I just varied it what I thought might look good. After they all had one coat, I went back in and did the second coat. Oh, with the painter's tape, I pull it off as soon as I can. So as soon as I've painted my stripes, I pull the painter's tape off. Now, as far as painting, of course the ones that have more texture, the ones where I used the Flex Bond and the Sculptamold, those are a little bit harder to paint, harder to get a straight line. With the traditional paper mache with the glue and the newspaper, that was very easy to paint. The paint went on so easily, I hardly had to use any paint on those, but it could run a little bit, particularly the acrylic paint, of course, versus the chalk paint. Also on the bottoms, where I hadn't covered any of them on the bottom, it's obviously harder to paint where we have just straight pool noodle, although I really like the way it looks because it looks closer to a traditional foam buoy. By the way, I'm saying buoy, I usually call them buoys, but because that's a homonym for boy, I decided to say buoy, which I think is a correct pronunciation, but it sounds very weird to me to keep saying buoy, where I always said, life buoy or fishing buoy or channel marker buoy. I've always used that pronunciation. So if it sounds weird to you, I apologize. It sounds weird to me too. This part is really fun because you get to pick the colors that you like for your decor or to your taste. I've told you the names of the paints that I used, but you might like, of course, something very different, and that's what makes this so much fun. Now, with one of the buoys, what I decided to do was use some of these stick-on letters, and I wrote number, NO, and then I just put some numbers down and I painted over them. And I should have pulled those up right when the paint was wet, but I didn't. So I had some trouble pulling them up after the paint had all dried over them. And, in a way that's okay because we want these to look aged. But I did go in and touch it up a tiny bit with a little bit of white paint because it really was hard to read the letters. At the point where I had them all painted with all of the colors that I was going to use, I was a little concerned because they were still looking pretty fake to me. So this next step where I went in and aged them was really crucial. And what I did was I looked for some reference photos. I will link to the photos. The ones that I used the most were from somebody's Etsy shop, so I hope that it's still available when you view this video. But if not, I think I just searched on fishing buoys or something like that, and I came up with other reference photos, but this Etsy shop was my favorite because it had a lot of really aged buoys. So I looked at the way they aged, and when you look at them you can see there are layers of paint underneath. There are definitely marks on them from where painted boats have brushed up against them, and or maybe other buoys where other things have brushed up against them, or maybe where they weren't painted carefully, and a lot of the paint has been worn off. So I mostly used a gray, a very light gray. So very close to the white, but not exactly white because I wanted it to look a little bit dirty, a little bit worn off. And I dabbed that over, very dry brushed, so I got most of the paint off of the brush when I did this, and dabbed it over the buoys. And then I took some of my colors and I brushed that through to make it look like there were either colors underneath, or again like that a boat had brushed up against the buoy, or it had gotten a little paint on it from another buoy or from when another buoy was painted. And after I did that, I was really pleased with the way they looked. I thought the aged versions of these buoys looked quite realistic. Now the final step is to put a little bit of rope through them. And this is the rope that you can get at the Dollar Tree. It's the nautical rope. I'm using the thinner rope, so you can see it's 9.5 feet in each bundle of rope. And I used one bundle of rope. It wasn't enough to do all of my buoys, but it was enough to do plenty of my buoys. And I cut, I'm going to say roughly a foot length for each buoy, but you of course should do it according to your buoys and according to what you want the rope to look like. So what I did was I would push the rope through the buoy from the bottom, and then for the top loop it over and stick it back in the buoy. It doesn't have to be doubled up all the way through the buoy. We just want to loop at the top. I used a little bit of jute twine and tied around the top, so tied that loop together at the top, and at the bottom I tied a single knot. Now a single knot really isn't big enough to work as a stopper for the size of this pool noodle hole. So I did use a little bit of hot glue in that pool noodle just to hold that knot in place. And I left the jute twine long enough so that I could tie them onto a fishing net with the jute twine. Now the second part of this project is to use some old pallet wood. I was driving by my Dollar Tree, and every time I would drive by I would see some pallets that were over near the garbage. So finally I went in and I asked, are those pallets garbage? Can I have them if they are? And the manager told me that his frozen guy just leaves the pallets and I should feel free to take them. He said sometimes they're just plain wood and there are some that are painted blue. I thought, I don't want a blue pallet, I want the regular wood pallets. And then I had this idea to use the blue pallets for a nautical craft. So originally I was going to make more little buoys like the little ones made out of the pool noodle, and I was going to make them out of little pieces of the blue pallet. But then I thought I would rather use them to make something larger and more like the real size of a buoy, or like a little faux pier, but just like a little block of nautical wood. And I thought make sort of a collection of 3 of them. So you can see the picture of the pallets from my Dollar Tree, and then I'm just going to show you a little bit of my struggle with pallets here. I am not good at taking pallets apart. I have never been able to just pull one apart. I've seen videos online of people who just take a crowbar or a hammer and they just pull those slats right off of the pallet, and I have never been able to do that. All of the pallets that I've ever had have been really old wood, kind of splintery, and it's been nailed into those, usually they're like 3 pieces of wood and the slats are nailed across those 3 pieces of wood. And it's been nailed and nailed again and re-nailed, sometimes even screwed in. And so I have almost never been able to get one entire slat off of a pallet in one piece. So here you can see me trying to pry it up, being successful in some places, but in many places splintering the wood. What I'm not showing you here, I didn't do it with this pallet, but what I have done in the past is just taken a skill saw and cut them. And that's why I end up with the shorter pallet boards, because they're just the length that's between those 3 pieces in the middle. I've also seen pallets that are free, like on Facebook Marketplace. I've never gone and picked any up from folks, but I've seen where people have just stacks and stacks of them. So I think that if you are interested in playing with pallet wood like I am, that you would be able to find pallets for free. Ask businesses if they seem to have a lot of them lying around, or look on Facebook Marketplace and see if anybody is giving them away. I have a sort of a hoarding problem with pallet wood because I just love the character that it has. So as soon as I have a piece of pallet wood, I don't want to use it for anything because I just love the way it looks. I did use this wood though. Now the blue pallet that I have here is kind of cool because it had these 4x4 blocks inside. And I thought the 4x4 blocks by themselves were really cool. So I was able to liberate one of those 4x4 blocks. In most cases, I was able to get all of the nails out, but with the 4x4 block, these nails were incredibly long and they were cut off at one end. So what I had to do was use a hacksaw, and I cut them off with the hacksaw. Before I did that, I pushed them through. I used a nail set and I punched them through so that they were a little bit longer on the side where they were poking out. And then I cut them off with a hacksaw, and then I used the nail set again and pushed them the other direction so that they were inset a little bit into the block. I also did not show it, but I got a plain wood pallet and I got some pieces off of that as well. I have this cool spackle. It's pink, and when you put it on, it turns white when it dries. I used this when I repaired the woodchuck porch last year. So I just filled the holes in that 4x4 block with this, but I left the holes in all the other wood that I have. Now I intend to use the 4x4 block, and I decided that I wanted a 12-inch tall holder because I think the 4x4 block was about 9 inches. So I decided I wanted like a 12-inch and a 16-inch, and then that kind of went out the window. I couldn't bear to give up any of that blue wood. I just thought that blue wood looked so cool that I made that one taller than I really should have. But I'm just showing you here basically how I measure and cut the wood, and you can see I've brought my saw out of the creepy basement and into the light of the deck here. And what I've learned about myself when it comes to measuring is that I'm going to make mistakes if I use the tape measure and measure every piece with the tape measure. I feel like that's too many places where you can make a mistake, because you can make a mistake with, or not even a mistake so much as there's always going to be a little bit of error when you do some measuring. So error with measuring, error with marking, and then error with cutting after. So what I do is after I've cut one piece, that becomes sort of like a blank for me, and I use that to cut all my other pieces. And that way they end up basically the same length, very close. So much better than if I tried to measure them all with the tape measure. And as far as safety with the saw, I never put my hands near that blade when it's going to come down. And I always clamp the wood and use the clamp, and don't have my hands near it when I'm using it. And I'm wearing a dust mask today. Now I really wanted all three of my wooden things to be different. So I had the wood block, and then I have the one that I cut with the blue wood. I cut a couple of pieces of blue wood and a couple of pieces of the plain wood, and I was just going to, nail them together. But then for the third one, what I decided to do was to make it more like boards, like decking. And so I cut small pieces. And I cut those so that this one would be square. The one with the blue boards is not square because I cut the boards to be the same size, and some are going to go on the inside and some are going to go on the outside. But for the one where I cut the little pieces so it would be more like boards or decking, I cut some of the pieces smaller. Those would go on the inside and the larger pieces on the outside, so that it would be a square shape. I also cut pieces to inset in the tops of them so that you could put something on top if you wanted to. So if you wanted to make these a candle holder, there would be something on top. My intention was to inset them so you would have a little bit of a lip, so that whatever you put on top hopefully wouldn't fall off. I had one piece that split apart when I cut it, but I liked it so much I decided to try to use it, so I glued it back together and then stapled it. I had plenty of pieces of wood. I didn't have to use it if it wasn't going to get put back together nicely, but I wanted to try because I liked the way it looked. It had those nail holes in it, and I thought it looked cool. Now, with the boards that I'm going to join together to make, that were supposed to look sort of like decking, I originally had thought that I would just abut them against each other and glue them together, and that's why I hadn't sanded them yet. Part of me thought I was an idiot for making so many surfaces that I would have to sand, and then I thought, well, I'm going to glue those together, so that will reduce the number of surfaces. But then I decided that they really would look better with spaces between them, and so I did have to sand all the surfaces after all. So I sanded them. This is a 60 grit sandpaper. I don't think I have a 40 grit for my mouse, and I think a 40 grit probably would have been better. But I was able to get them pretty flat because some of them where the nail holes were, on the other side the wood was sticking out where the nails had come out, so I had to get that flat. So I was able to sand them all down so that there aren't any splinters or nasty edges that will hurt anybody. And now what I decided to do was to use some cotton. This was sort of to stick in the crevices. On a ship, they will put something called oakum, or they will put cotton into the cracks between the boards, and then I believe they caulk that. So I decided to attach the planks together with spaces between them, and so I just used these larger craft sticks from the Dollar Tree, glued them down, and stapled them. Now, when I did this, because the boards that I cut weren't exactly the same size, that's a property of pallet wood. It's all different size boards that are on there. I'm using my little X-Acto mat so that I'm getting the same height. So I have to have larger spaces between the smaller boards and smaller spaces between the larger boards. Now, a mistake I made that I will warn you about, so hopefully you don't make it. I had wanted to inset that piece of wood in the top so that there would be a lip around it, but I put the popsicle sticks really too close to the top. And I ended up trying to cut them away, and I was able to cut them away a little bit near the top, but really not as much as I wanted to. The wood glue works really well, so they were stuck on there pretty well. So I would just say, don't put them very close to the top so that you do have that area where you can inset a piece of wood. Now this cotton that I'm using, it's just an old canvasy sort of bag from the Dollar Tree. I used other parts of it in another project. And I just used the handles, and then I cut strips from part of the rest of it and sort of folded them up, put some just white glue on them and stuck them in the cracks. And I feel like I should have been a little bit more committed to this and either pushed more in so that it came up to the surface where you could see it, or actually put caulk in there, but I didn't. I just put in the one piece into all of the cracks. And so I feel like, again, that I wasn't really committed enough to this look of like a ship's deck. Now to assemble both of these, we'll call them candle holders, together, I simply used wood glue, I drilled holes, and I started with these little 1-inch nails, which I think are nails, but according to where I found them in the Home Depot aisle, they're brads. So if you go looking for these and you go to Home Depot, they're called brads. They're not in the finished nail section, which is where I thought they would be. I broke 2 drill bits. I started by using a non-corded drill, and I broke 2 drill bits because some of this wood is a little bit hard. When I used a corded drill and my final remaining drill bit, then I was able to drill without breaking any drill bits. It may be the quality of the drill bit, or it may be the power of the drill, but I had more luck that way. But I just lined them up, drilled holes, and then nailed the nails in. Now the 1-inch nails really turned out not to be long enough, so I went and got 1 1/4 and 1 1/2 inch, and I ended up using the 1 1/4. They were long enough. And I really can't nail on this little table. It's just a little card table. So you're not seeing me nail these in completely. I'm just getting them nailed in enough that it's into the lower piece of wood, and then I'm taking them down to a hard surface and finishing the nailing in. And then I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out how I wanted to finish them. And I looked at some of the different sorts of nautical rope that the Dollar Tree has. They have the white rope and they have the brown rope. And I also looked at some of their embellishments, like the starfish, and their nets, their nautical nets, I guess. And what I ended up doing was I decided not to use the embellishments. I thought you could always stick one on, but that I would leave them fairly plain for now. But I used the net on the blue one, and for the plain one I thought it was just too much raw wood, so I mixed a wash of a very light gray paint, and I did every other board in the light gray paint, and then I wrapped some rope around the bottom, and I also wrapped rope along the sort of the seams that went up and over. And for that rope, I did whip it at the ends. You've probably seen me do this technique before. The first place I did it was in a candle video. And this is how you finish the end of a rope. You whip in the opposite direction that the rope has been wound, I guess. Make a loop from whatever you're whipping with. I whipped with some jute here. And then you just wrap around the rope over your loop, finally put the end through the end of your loop, and then pull it with the other end under the wrapping that you did, and then pull it tight. So I'll link the candle video here where maybe you can see it in a little more detail. And here's how they look outside. What I did was I hung them from the rest of that net. That's just one of those little Dollar Tree nets. And I think this is what they're good for. The net has a very wide opening, so it's hard to use it like on something like a pillow or some sort of small scale indoor decor. I feel like that net doesn't work. But out here on my deck, I could just hang it over the tops of, that's a fence basically that we've used on our deck for some privacy, and I've just hung it over the top of the fence and then used the jute on the little buoys to tie them to the rope. And at the very top I have some lights that I had gotten at a place we have here in New England called the Christmas Tree Shop. I just thought they kind of went with it and looked sort of nice with it. And then you can see my wooden pieces on that little table there. And I did try just taking one of those little lanterns from the Dollar Tree, it's in the garden section, and putting them on top of one of the blocks of wood. I don't like that lantern particularly, that's why I didn't bother to paint it up and make it look any better. But I've seen nicer lanterns that are very similar at Target in the dollar spot section. So I think something maybe slightly larger, I think the scale is wrong there, could look really cute. Or it does make a nice candle holder. Now inside, I like the way I have it on my fireplace. I like this grouping a little bit better, although I think that probably I wouldn't have the whole net hang down over the fireplace like that. I think I would maybe swoop it a little bit more. And the thing about this is, if you just sort of grab that net in the middle and hold it up, you end up with a long bit of net with buoys in it, and that also looks really cool. So this could look really cool just hanging, and it would be a long thin decoration that way. So I'm actually really pleased with the way this came out.
So what did you think of our project today? As usual, I had so much fun making it. One thing that I really like about the buoy project, besides that you can paint them however you want, so you can match your color scheme or get whatever sort of look you want, is that whatever method you use for paper mache really doesn't make that much difference in how they come out in the end. So you can base that decision on other considerations like who's making the project and what you have available. With the wood project, as always, I had a lot of fun with that one, and I like the wood pieces better separately than I like them together, I think because I didn't make them the heights that I had originally planned. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. If you made any of these projects, please tell me about it in the comments. I would love to hear about it, especially if you didn't paper mache the buoys. I would love to know how that came out. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.